Hello, everybody. This is Jeff Carrithers with globalair.com, and I have Jeremy Cox with me today from JetValues. Jeremy. Well, Jeremy, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about JetValues, Jeremy?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. Absolutely. So, I've been around airplanes since I was 9 years of age. I had an apprenticeship as a mechanic in the UK. I have about 1,200 hours as a pilot. I've done 2 Atlantic deliveries with the little airplanes. I used to tow targets for flight refueling aviation as a winchman and mechanic, and I often got to fly the airplane and log the time under instruction. Got a bunch of time in the Cessna Conquest and the 55 Baron that we towed drogue targets with. Let's see, I used to do aerial photography. I taught people how to crop dust. Did a number of different things in aviation, mainly as a mechanic, and then I got into maintenance sales, company here in St. Louis when I moved here, and then ended up buying and selling airplanes at jet brokers for close to 20 years until I left and started JetValues, Jeremy, appraising airplanes. So I left the realm of buying and selling airplanes to be specifically dealing only with appraising airplanes and aircraft values. And so I've done that since January 2019.
I know you and I met, I guess 20 years ago, at least. And I have to say you were always probably the most knowledgeable person about aircraft that I've ever met and ever known. And I think what you moved into, appraisals is just absolutely perfect for you, because I do believe that you're probably one of the foremost authorities in aircraft, and I'm sure aircraft appraisals, both large and small. So, you and I have talked about the current market for ages, both small piston aircraft, vintage aircraft, up to the large corporate aircraft, to even some commercial. We've talked about that for years. We both agree right now it's a very brisk market. And what we'd like to kind of chat about would be, what would be a good guideline for the aircraft buyer right now in terms of, placing a value on an aircraft?
Let's talk about value itself. I mean, value, the definition of value is it's the monetary relationship between properties and those who buy, sell, or use those properties, in this case, properties being aircraft. And it's expressed as an opinion of the worth or value of a property at a given time. So when you get an appraisal, there's always a specific date. So obviously, appraising an airplane today and September 2022 is a lot different from a market standpoint than it was in 2020 or at least 2019 before the pandemic. So obviously the goalposts, as you would put it, change with market conditions.
That's always usually moving.
It's constantly moving, and I personally deal with 2 main values: fair market value. People call it market value, but fair market value, it's the number basically between that results from the sale between a willing buyer and a willing seller, neither being under any compulsion to buy or sell, and both having reasonable knowledge of relevant facts as of a specific date. It's always got to be that specific date, because obviously I appraise today, well, 6 months from now, it's going to be totally different, maybe even a month from now. So that's why we always drive the stake in the ground and have an effective date. The other value I normally deal with, especially for bank appraisals, is an orderly liquidation value. And it's an opinion of the gross amount expressed in terms of money that typically could be realized from a liquidation sale, given a reasonable period of time to find a purchaser or purchases, with the seller being compelled to sell on a specific as is, where is basis on that date. And I can tell you, banks require this value, and I usually project it out to 5 and 15 years, because a lot of the banks have been offering 15-year terms on their loans as well as 5-year. So
that will actually come into play when a buyer is looking for finance. They want to kind of they go to the bank, they're looking for finance, so the bank is going to go out and hire you, for instance, to find out what would be the approximate value at that given time, and then give you an outlook for the next 5 or 10 years, depending on the loan term. Give us kind of an overview on how you develop an appraisal on aircraft. Let's take like a middle of the road aircraft, not a small piston. How about a Pilatus PC-12? Do you have a certain formula that you go by? How do you go about doing, your appraisals?
Well, really, there's no difference whether it's a Piper Cub or a spacecraft. I mean, the same process to performing an appraisal is involved in every type of aircraft that I deal with. It's the same. I mean, there's 3 approaches to value, which is market, which is what I normally use, but there's also cost, and there's income. Income is rarely used because unless you're appraising the business itself. I mean, I've done a handful, and it comes into play for a museum, say. You have to take into consideration the drawer of the specific aircraft that's on display statically or a flying airplane. How much of the annual ticket sales to enter that museum are apportioned up because as a result of the aircraft that I'm appraising. So I'll use income, but I rarely use it, and that's why I didn't bring it up. But the process is the same. So you've got the 3 approaches to value. First off, I have to know what the need or the purpose is for the appraisal. The need for the appraisal is it for bank financing? Is it for legal action? Is it for an insurance claim? Is it for a market sale? Is it to determine what the asking price and predicted selling price is?
But let's just say, in our sake of conversation today, we're talking about, personal use or corporate flight department that's looking to purchase an aircraft.
All right, so I'm going to do it as if it's for bank financing. So the need or purpose of the appraisal is for bank financing. So I'm going to talk to the client and find out those facts, and I'll generate an engagement letter, which I send through DocuSign. They'll sign it, and that also is where they agree to my price to perform the appraisal and how long it's going to take. So that's step 1. Step 2 is, once it's signed, I obtain the FAA files. If it's a U.S. registered airplane, even airplanes outside of the U.S., usually, if they were built in the U.S., will have an FAA file. And I'm talking about airworthiness and registration. Obviously, for aircraft outside of the U.S. that have never been registered in the U.S., then there's no file. So I have to dig deeper through other means other than the FAA. But I'll get the FAA files. I'll determine the total time and cycles. I'll get the maintenance inspection status. I'll determine what modifications have been installed on the airplane. And there's a variety of places I get that information, because not always do all the FAA Form 337s. I'm going to assume this is a U.S. airplane at this stage. Not all the FAA Form 337s make it to Oklahoma City and get placed in the file. So,
really?
Oh yeah, it happens a lot, actually. And so for an on-site inspection, an on-site audit when I see the airplane, but that's probably about 20% of my time. I do about 100 airplanes a year. This year is a different year, and I'll talk about that later on. And I think a lot of it is because of the market conditions, supply and demand, total lack of supply and over demand. So it's been frantic. But if I'm on site, I'll actually look at the flight manual, and the 337s are required to be in the flight manual, or at least the flight manual supplements, as well as the 337s. And I'll often find 337s in there that are not in the FAA records. Also, looking at the airplane, I've got to be familiar with type, make and model of the airplane and what's normal on the airplane to determine whether things have been modified, changed, added, subtracted, what have you. And they all have an effect on value, on the value of that airplane. So I have to consider that.
So Jeremy, so let's just to define for those who might not know what 337 is. 337, in my book has always been, has there been a structural change to the airframe? Is that about right, or is there something a little bit more in depth?
It doesn't have to be structural. It's a major alteration or repair. It's a record of major alteration or repair. Now, remember, repair stations are not required to file complete 337s and file them. They can quote a work order number. So that's another reason why, especially if we're talking about a corporate airplane. Generally speaking, most maintenance, repair, or overhaul facilities will write a 337 and submit it to the FAA, but some don't. And that's another reason why you won't find a 337. So you have to do the research.
But you have to say that most major repair stations across the country that are that would be doing high-end corporate aircraft, things like that, those would be well known to the industry, and they would be filing those copies, correct?
I have not come across a successful MRO that doesn't complete and file the 337s, but there are some nefarious operators out there, so it's possible it's not. I've seen it. I have seen it when I do logbook audits and reviews where a work order number is quoted and there's no further information. So it does happen. Avionics, obviously. Oh, and back to your question about structural. No, in fact, like a flight management system, an FMS that has a software update, a 337 is generally filed because that's a major alteration. It's a software alteration, and it needs to go in the airworthiness record for the airplane.
Boy, so, I bet you that was a big play back when RVSM started coming in.
Oh, absolutely. And obviously, the way the aircraft's configured avionics-wise has a part in its value. If it's an older airplane, it's probably had retrofits and upgrades performed. They will be shown in the 337s, but for the reasons I've just mentioned, they may not. So it's very important to actually really look deeply. If I'm doing a desktop, I need pictures and records so I can actually do the research to determine what is in the airplane, what's not. Aircraft specific issues. Are there some issues where, say, for instance, the aircraft has had some corrosion and it's on a individual inspection requirement that, there needs to be NDT or something that reoccurs until it's determined that the aircraft goes back to its regular maintenance schedule? Or is the airplane on a approved aircraft inspection program where the requirements that the factory sets out for the airplane to be maintained, the calendar and hourly and cycle schedule has been changed by the operator? That's going to have an effect on the value.
Is that, I was saying, that is that a big item when it comes to the values, just the maintenance schedule? If they don't keep on it from the factory required or factory mandated, if they veer from that and go to something different, that's a kind of a big red flag.
Well, I don't know about a red flag, but it's something that I have to consider when I'm determining the fair market value of an aircraft. I mean, if it's unusual from a bad standpoint, I mean, plain vanilla is better if it stands out and it's an unusual airplane. It differs from the fleet. Generally speaking, from a value standpoint, it's not a good thing because say, for instance, you're running on an authorization letter to go beyond TBO, which is fairly easy to get. Say, for instance, Pratt & Whitney gives you an extension, say a 10-15% extension to match up with a big inspection for the airframe and to pull the airplane down for that and do the engine at the same time, whatever. You got to remember that is operator specific. That extension is not transferable. So the moment that airplane changes hands, then the engines have to be overhauled.
It goes right back to the standard, and you have to overhaul them at that point.
Yep.
That's going to cost an operator an arm and a leg if he's not ready for it.
Well, but the whole point is my job. I'm not there as the police. I'm not there as an FAA inspector, even though I do have my AMP and IA, but I'm not looking at it from an airworthiness standpoint. I'm looking at it from a value standpoint. And if there are issues, inherent issues, which are specific to the aircraft that if I don't consider them, then I'm going to come up with an incorrect value because it has to be considered. The value has to be credible. And there's a reason why there are some airplanes out there, especially very high time airplanes, that transact a lot lower or below what would be considered the normal fair market value for the same make and model. There are so many variables that affect the value that I've got to consider as the appraiser. And the buyer has to know about that and consider that. Just for buying the airplane.
Just for the sake of asking and for our viewers, what would you say would be, a couple of the major items that would, drop the value of an aircraft, from the fleet? Like my first thought was, major damage history, a gear collapse or something like that, and it altered the airframe. Back in my day, you were looking at 50% of the value almost. What are a couple of the major items that would just really hurt the value of an aircraft?
Well, I mean, the easiest one to talk about, and I'll talk about others, is are the engines covered by a service plan? If the majority of the fleet are covered by service plans and the engines on the aircraft that I'm appraising aren't, then obviously it's not like kind, or it's not average against the rest of the fleet. Therefore, it's going to be worth less than the aircraft, the majority of the fleet that have engine programs. So that's a factor. Damage history is a factor, obviously. And if it's got weird stuff on it, I mean, like for instance, it's been put on an experimental certificate of airworthiness, and it's the test bed for some special crazy mod, and that's the only airplane out there that has this mod. It may do amazing things to the performance or the safety of the aircraft, but if it's the only one, then how does that affect the value? Are you gonna, is the same protocol, or at least the same belief that spending the money on that mod is going to enhance the aircraft specifically for the current owner? Maybe you won't find another owner that sees it the same way you do and think, well, I don't want this. This is weird. So obviously it's going to have an effect on the value of the airplane. I mean, the problem is, even though aircraft leave the factory basically cookie cutter to a certain extent, there's a lot of options that are available when you order the airplane, but they're not wildly varying. I mean, you can have a SATCOM system that's satellite based, or you can have an air to ground system that's ground based. But you're not going to have wildly differing differences. For instance, airplanes that operate out of the U.S. that are for foreign countries, non-U.S. countries, will usually have a flight data recorder. A lot of the airplanes in this country don't. A few years back, now pretty much most of the new airplanes, big airplanes, will have a flight data recorder, but they're not going to vary that much. But when you have an airplane that does vary, that does stick out, then it's going to be different. And you have to consider that. So once I've considered everything, including the ownership history, and I've done quite a few of rare and valuable airplanes this year, one of which I did Dwight D. Eisenhower's first Air Force One, Columbine 2, a Lockheed Constellation, a straight Constellation. I've done some other planes, which, they're rare and unusual. I just did a couple of airplanes that they're the only two flying on the planet. And I can't talk, I'd like to talk about it, but I can't talk about it. Just like the spacecraft I did last year. I mean, it just so many different things that are involved in the appraisal process, but I need to consider also ownership history and what I call provenance, what Sotheby's and Christie's and other bespoke people that deal with high value art and other things, they call it provenance, and provenance is the history of that object. And in this case, aircraft, an airplane owned by the Pope, which actually hasn't happened, but there are airplanes that have operated for the Pope, or the Queen. She owns some airplanes. Obviously, those airplanes, when they come to market for resale, an airplane owned by the Queen, God rest her soul, is worth a lot more because of its history than one that's just a standard citation.
Let's define something real quick, just to make sure. I look at the value of an aircraft with a pedigree.
Yeah.
Meaning, if it comes from a corporate flight department that we know there's a known flight department that's been around for 20 years and runs a grade A straight perfect flight department, we know everything has been touched on the airplane correctly. That's what I look at in pedigree. Now, you're saying that the value can be different because of maybe a celebrity. So what would be the difference?
Well, I mean, the difference between, and I don't know, it doesn't come to mind. I do know it because I've made presentations on value before, and I've talked about pedigree, but pedigree and provenance are two totally different things.
Well, that's something that the buyer definitely has to define before he buys an aircraft.
Well, you may not know going into it what the provenance of the aircraft is, or you may very well know. You may know that this was Elvis Presley's airplane, and it's marketed and sold at auction, or however it's sold. This was Elvis's airplane. Obviously, then you do know some provenance. You look into it, but for buying a regular, like when we're talking about a Pilatus PC-12, so you're going to have a better idea as pedigree long before you research the provenance. And the pedigree comes from horses, as you well know, being down in Kentucky. The pedigree is the quality, is who were the parents. We're talking about horses. We're going to move straight to airplanes, but basically, who were the parents of this horse, and how has this horse been living and cared for, and what races and so forth. But going back to airplanes, I mean, if the airplane was delivered new and the person you're doing the appraisal for has had that airplane from new, and they've only ever gone to the factory service centers for all the maintenance, and every entry in the logbooks are from the service centers, and they're complete entries. They don't have a weird reference to a work order without any further information. And the owner of that airplane has kept every invoice against that airplane, every 8130 airworthiness tag, every piece of paper that has ever been generated for that airplane, and digitally as well, because we're in a digital age. In fact, I prefer to live without paper at all, personally. And so there are some airplanes out there that everything is digital. As long as you keep everything and it hasn't had damage history, it's not unusual compared to the rest of the fleet. It's not high time or extremely low time. It doesn't have a wacky paint job or wacky unusual interior. Then, you know, it's got pedigree. Provenance has nothing to do with that. Provenance is who owned it and what's its history. I mean, take for instance a P-51 from World War II. If that airplane flew in World War II over in Europe and actually had some kills and shot down some airplanes that have been documented, and there are pictures from 1944 or whatever for that airplane, then that airplane is going to have a lot more value than one that was delivered in 1945, never made it across the pond, flew in the National Guard or something, and then was removed from service or struck off charge, as the military call it, and sold as surplus. If it has no wartime history, then it's worth less than an airplane that has a wartime history. That's provenance. Make sense?
Oh, absolutely. So what I like to say is, I'll take that P-51 that's been based here in the States all of its life, be a lot cheaper. I'll buy it.
True.
So Jeremy, you know, kind of wrapping up our conversation, what would you say would be the one major factor on the effect of a value of an aircraft? What would be your one biggie that you would pick out?
Well, honestly, I would say we just talked about it. It's pedigree. If somebody has managed the aircraft as an asset, they've managed it professionally and with great care, records, maintenance, managing events, whether they're good events or bad events. If it's all eyes wide open, so you remove the question from a buyer's, future buyer's expectations when they're considering the airplane. And don't, as I said, don't make the aircraft unique. You know, don't have this wacky paint job that you put it on the market and, you know, it's got X-Men and, you know, wacky thunderbolts and lightning and all sorts of things on it that, you know, the next owner doesn't share your passion for it.
They're not going to want it, right?
They're not going to want it. So don't make it weird. Paint an interior. Don't have weird mods. You know, don't make it the first Stagger Wing Hawker 900 XP in existence, because who the hell's going to buy that? It may do amazing things to the performance of the airplane, but when it comes time to resell it, I mean, only if 300 other airplanes out there have the mod, then do it, you know? Bad maintenance, bad repairs, that kind of stuff. Pedigree. That's probably the one thing that people need to really consider, especially if they're buying.
That's kind of what the common denominator that I've heard through the discussion comes down to, the pedigree, which, you know, record keeping will be everything.
Yeah.
So what's the prediction for the market finishing up 2022?
Well, as frantic as usual, I think. I normally do about 100 airplanes a year, and that's everything from crop dusters to you know, Boeings. But I'm well and truly past the 100 aircraft mark, and here we are in the beginning of September. So where is it going to end? I don't know.
Already?
Oh, already. Yep. But I think the problem that haunts everybody and I don't buy and sell. I'm not an aircraft broker in any way, shape, or form. I did for 20 years, but I do talk to brokers daily. When I do an appraisal, I need 8 comparative sales. So I talk to the brokers every single day, and the biggest problem still is inventory. There's a lack of inventory, even though the numbers have gone up slightly, but actually having something in your hands with a listing agreement on to sell as a broker, or to have in your hangar as a dealer, you bought it and you're attempting now to improve it, make it a better mousetrap selling proposition, and resell it and make a profit. It's difficult because you're competing against a whole lot of buyers that want an airplane. The pandemic has created this situation. When we had the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, we saw massive drops in fair market value of airplanes. I mean, some cases we saw 60, 70% that literally happened over an 18-month period. People say these are crazy values, these are crazy prices, but you know what? It's today. They're now prices, now values. So it's what they're worth. If you're living a year, 18 months, 2 years in the past, then you're not relevant. Your opinion's not relevant because this is now pricing. These are now values. But the now values, now prices are probably back to where these airplanes should have been if we didn't have the global financial crisis, where Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae went down the toilet. So
I've had many in the brokerage field say the same thing. Yep. Exactly the same thing.
Yeah. And I see it every day, because all I do is I don't buy and sell. I'm forming an opinion, a credible and realistic opinion of value. And so I have to consider everything to do with the subject airplane. And I can tell you, airplanes are 30, 40, in some cases 50% above where they were pre-pandemic value-wise. But
and I think, Jeremy, that's what makes you such an expert, by the way, is that you are looking at every angle on that aircraft, that airframe, to come up with angle. And that's why I believe your business does so well. And
thank you.
Why people come to you as an authority. I certainly do.
Jeff.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Cox with JetValues Jeremy. At jetvaluesjeremy.com. If you're looking for an appraisal service, I can't overstate how well Mr. Cox runs his business. So thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate your time today.